September 1880, Dakota Territory settlement near De Smet. 3 Finnish lumberjacks begin constructing a cabin unlike anything the local settlers have seen before. The corners don't overlap in the usual way. Every log surface is meticulously shaped and fitted. Residents passing by shake their heads at the wasted effort. These experienced timbermen are spending weeks on details that won't matter come winter. Or so everyone thinks. By February 1881, those same settlers would discover just how wrong they were. The difference between life and death in the worst winter anyone could remember would come down to something most people never even noticed: the way corners were cut. The story of what happened that winter teaches a lesson about craftsmanship, preparation, and the difference between building something quickly and building it right. What looked like unnecessary complexity in autumn became the reason families survived spring. What seemed like foolish perfectionism turned out to be accumulated knowledge about surviving in conditions that would test every structure to its limits. In the autumn of 1880, 2 distinct philosophies governed cabin construction across the Dakota Territory frontier. Settlers arriving from the east brought limited building knowledge and an urgent need for shelter before winter. They built quickly using round logs stacked horizontally with simple notched corners. A family working together could raise the walls of a basic cabin in 3 or 4 days. The construction method was straightforward. Find straight pine or spruce trees, cut them to length, notch the ends with an axe so they'd stack at corners, fill gaps between logs with mud mixed with grass or horsehair, build a stone chimney, cover it with a roof of sod or split shingles, move in before the first snow. This approach had served countless frontier families adequately through normal winters. The cabins weren't comfortable by any measure. Wind whistled through gaps where logs didn't fit perfectly. Snow sometimes drifted through cracks in bitter cold. But with a good fire and enough firewood, families stayed warm enough to survive. The lumberjacks arriving from Wisconsin and Michigan logging camps brought a different perspective. Many came from Finnish, Swedish, and Norwegian backgrounds where log building wasn't just a temporary necessity, but a refined craft passed down through generations. They'd spent winters in logging camp bunkhouses that had to keep crews alive and working in conditions far harsher than most settlers ever experienced. These timbermen looked at the typical settler cabin and saw dozens of places where winter would find its way in. Every simple notched corner created a gap. Every round log meant uneven surfaces that couldn't seal properly. Every shortcut taken in construction represented a weakness that extreme cold would exploit. When 3 Finnish lumberjacks, Matti Järvinen, Antti Koskinen, and Eero Virtanen began building a cabin 5 miles northeast of the De Smet settlement in September 1880, locals immediately noticed something different. The men had worked in Michigan lumber camps for 7 years. They'd seen cabins that lasted decades and cabins that collapsed after 3 winters. They knew what separated the two. Their approach started with the trees themselves. While settlers grabbed whatever straight trunks they could find, the lumberjacks spent days selecting specific trees. They wanted white pine of consistent diameter, about 12 to 14 inches thick. They needed straight grain with minimal knots. They rejected any tree showing rot or excessive twist. After felling each tree, they didn't immediately drag it to the building site. First came the careful removal of bark using draw knives' flat blades with handles at both ends that peeled away bark in smooth strips. This step alone made settlers shake their heads. Why waste time stripping bark when it would just rot away eventually anyway? But the lumberjacks knew better. Bark held moisture against wood. Moisture invited insects and rot. A debarked log would dry properly and last longer. More importantly, for immediate survival, a smooth log surface without bark created a tighter seal when stacked. The next step separated their method even further from typical practice. After debarking, the lumberjacks used broadaxes to hew flat surfaces on the top and bottom of each log. They'd snap a chalk line down the log's length, then stand on top and swing the broadaxe with practiced precision, removing wood until the surface was flat. This process took hours per log. Settlers who watched couldn't understand the logic. Why flatten logs that nature had already made round? The round shape seemed perfectly fine for stacking. The lumberjacks never bothered explaining to skeptical neighbors. The reasons were obvious to anyone who'd actually thought about how logs seal against each other. A round log sitting on another round log created one small contact line. Air, wind, snow, everything found its way through the gaps. Two flat surfaces pressed together created a seal across the entire width. No gaps, no infiltration. But the real distinction in their approach showed at the corners. This is where settlers gathered to watch and make jokes. Corner construction in log cabins wasn't just aesthetic. The corners held everything together. They determined how logs locked in place. They controlled how structures settled and aged. Most critically, corners created either the largest weak points or the strongest seals in the entire building. The standard method used by Dakota Territory settlers in 1880 was the saddle notch. At each corner, the builder would notch a half-circle depression in the top of one log where it would meet the log crossing perpendicular above it. The notch let the upper log nestle into the lower one. This technique worked reasonably well. It was fast. Any man with an axe and basic skills could cut saddle notches. The logs interlocked enough to stay in place. For a temporary shelter, it sufficed. The method had clear weaknesses. Water could pool in the horizontal notches, leading to rot. The joints loosened over time as logs dried and shrank. Most importantly, the rounded notches created gaps that wind penetrated easily. Even when packed with mud or moss, these gaps leaked air when temperatures dropped severely. Matti Järvinen learned a different technique growing up in Finland. His family had built log structures for generations using what they called full dovetail joints. The method was ancient, dating back centuries in Scandinavian countries where winters killed anyone whose cabin leaked heat. The dovetail corner required precise cutting but created a joint that actually tightened under pressure rather than loosening. The principle was simple in concept but demanding in execution. At each log end, the builder would cut a trapezoidal shape wider at the outer face, narrower toward the interior. The expanding taper meant logs couldn't pull apart. The joint literally locked itself together. As logs dried and settled, they pressed more firmly into place rather than creating gaps. Creating these joints took skill. First came careful measurement with a straight edge and marking knife. The angles had to be exact. Then came the cutting with handsaw and chisel. Each face of the trapezoid needed to be flat and true. Any deviation meant the joint wouldn't seat properly. When done correctly, a dovetail corner was beautiful to see. The interlocking puzzle pieces showed obvious craftsmanship. But beauty wasn't the point. The point was that dovetail corners shed water instead of collecting it. They tightened under load. They created minimal gaps for wind penetration. As the three lumberjacks worked through September, cutting and fitting each log end with careful precision, settler families passed by with increasing skepticism. The men were spending entire days on single logs. They'd cut a dovetail, test fit it, remove it, trim the joint slightly, test again. Hours of work for one corner joint. "Those Finns are building a mansion, not a cabin," one settler remarked to his wife as they watched Järvinen measure and remeasure an angle. "They'll be working through December at this rate," another commented. "My cabin took 4 days. They've been at it 3 weeks and barely have 6 rows up." The criticism didn't bother the lumberjacks. Antti Koskinen had seen logging camp cabins in northern Michigan where temperatures dropped to 40 below zero for weeks. He'd seen men die in poorly built structures when stoves couldn't keep ahead of the cold pouring through gaps. He'd also seen well-built cabins where temperatures stayed livable even in the worst conditions. The difference came down to details that looked foolish until they saved your life. By mid-October, the lumberjacks had the walls up to 7 feet. Each corner showed the distinctive stepped profile of interlocking dovetails. Between each log course, they'd placed thin strips of pine bark as gasket material, then compressed everything tight as they stacked. The result was a wall system with virtually no visible gaps anywhere. They also did something else that puzzled observers. They built the cabin larger than typical settler structures. Most families crammed into tiny one-room cabins measuring 12 feet square or slightly larger. The Lumberjacks built an 18 by 24-foot structure with substantial wall height. "Why so big?" a neighbor asked Järvinen one afternoon. "You'll never heat that much space." Järvinen smiled slightly. Smaller cabin, walls closer to stove, logs overheat, dry out too fast, crack and warp. Bigger cabin, heat spreads better, walls stay more stable, also gives room for proper air circulation. Stale air in a tiny cabin can kill you as sure as cold. The neighbor walked away, shaking his head. These timber men had an answer for everything, but it all seemed like overthinking simple problems. By late October, with the walls complete and the roof going on, most settlers had stopped paying attention to the strange cabin. It was well built, certainly, but absurdly over-engineered for frontier life. That much effort might make sense for a permanent town building, but for a basic homestead cabin? Wasteful. Then the weather changed. October 15, 1880, started as a pleasant autumn day across the Dakota Territory. Temperatures reached the low 50s, clear skies stretched to every horizon. Settlers worked outside with coats off, taking advantage of good weather to finish preparations for winter. By noon, the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. Clouds appeared from nowhere, thick and dark, moving with unsettling speed. By 2 in the afternoon, the temperature was below freezing and falling fast. An hour later, snow began. Not the gentle first snow of approaching winter, a blizzard. Wind arrived with the snow, howling across the prairie with nothing to slow it. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The temperature plunged. By evening, the blizzard was in full fury, and the thermometer read 15 degrees. By morning, it showed 5 below zero. The storm didn't stop. It continued day after day with only brief pauses. When one system passed, another arrived behind it. The snow kept falling. The wind kept screaming. The temperature kept dropping. Settlers who'd experienced Dakota winters before were stunned. October blizzards happened, certainly, but this was different. This was the kind of storm you'd expect in January, not October. Most families hadn't finished stocking firewood. Harvests sat partially gathered. Some cabins lacked finished roofs or proper chinking. The town of Desmet found itself essentially cut off from the outside world by late October. Railroad companies tried to run supply trains but couldn't keep tracks clear. Crews would dig out a section only to have it fill in again hours later. By early November, the railroad suspended service until the weather improved. That improvement never came. November brought more blizzards. December was worse. January 1881 became a month of almost continuous storms. February delivered several blizzards that lasted 9 days straight with whiteout conditions. The snow piled so high against buildings that many were partially buried. Drifts reached 20 feet in places. Inside typical settler cabins, families fought to survive. The constant wind found every gap, every crack, every imperfect joint. Even with stoves burning continuously, temperatures inside often dropped below freezing overnight. Ice formed on the inside walls where warm air met cold surfaces. Windows frosted over so thick you couldn't see out. The cabins built with simple saddle-notch corners struggled the most. Those rounded joints that seemed adequate in September became life-threatening weak points in January. Wind penetrated through the corners. The gaps between round logs widened as wood contracted in the extreme cold. Packing materials dried out and crumbled. Chinking fell out of joints. Families stuffed blankets and clothing into gaps. They hung additional quilts over walls, trying to create an insulating layer. They burned through firewood at frightening rates just to keep interior temperatures barely above freezing. Some families burned furniture when firewood ran out. Others burned buffalo chips and twisted hay. Anything combustible went into the stove. Food supplies became critical by January. With trains not running, no supplies reached the territory. Families rationed what they had. In Desmet, merchants formed committees to distribute remaining stocks fairly. Some families faced real starvation. Through all of this, virtually no one could visit neighbors to check on their welfare. The blizzards came so frequently and with such ferocity that venturing outside meant risking death. People got lost and froze to death within yards of their own doors, disoriented in whiteout conditions. 5 miles northeast of Desmet, in the cabin built by 3 Finnish lumberjacks, a different experience was unfolding. When the October 15th blizzard hit, Matti Järvinen and his 2 partners were fortunate to be inside with the cabin essentially finished. They'd installed the roof just days earlier. The door was hung, the stove was in place, and the chimney drawing properly. As the wind began howling that first night, the 3 men sat around their stove, listening to the storm. The cabin creaked and groaned as wind pressure tested it, but nothing moved. No drafts penetrated the corners. No wind whistled through gaps. The carefully cut dovetail joints held firm under stress. "This is going to be bad," Koskinen said quietly, staring at the frosted window. "That wind is Dakota prairie wind with nothing to stop it. I've never heard anything like this." They were right. The storm was extraordinary. But their cabin, built with such careful attention to details that neighbors mocked, performed exactly as they designed it to. The dovetail corners made the critical difference. Under the tremendous wind pressure, logs pressed more tightly together rather than pulling apart. The trapezoidal joints couldn't separate. Where settler cabins developed larger gaps as logs shifted, the lumberjack's cabin actually sealed more completely. The hewn flat surfaces between log courses eliminated the air infiltration that plagued round log construction. There were simply no pathways for wind to penetrate. The pine bark gaskets compressed between courses created additional sealing. The result was a cabin that retained heat with remarkable efficiency. With the larger floor space, heat from their stove circulated without overheating the walls. In the cramped settler cabins, stoves burned so hot trying to heat freezing air that the adjacent walls often dried out excessively and cracked. The lumberjacks maintained comfortable interior temperatures without thermal stress on their structure. The roof design also mattered. They'd built a steeper pitch than was common, knowing that heavy snow loads required adequate drainage. As snow accumulated to enormous depths through the winter, their roof shed the weight. Many settler cabins with shallower roofs faced partial collapse under snow loads they weren't designed to support. By December, word had spread about the lumberjack's cabin. A few neighboring families who'd managed visits between storms reported something remarkable. The Finns weren't just surviving, they were comfortable. Their cabin stayed warm enough that ice didn't form on interior walls. They weren't burning excessive firewood. They weren't stuffing gaps with whatever they could find. The difference was so pronounced that some settlers initially didn't believe the reports. How could the cabin they'd mocked as overbuilt perform so much better than standard construction? The answer lay in every detail they'd dismissed as unnecessary. By January, desperation forced some families to relocate. Several settler cabins had become essentially uninhabitable. Gaps had widened to the point where keeping the interior above freezing was impossible no matter how much fuel was burned. Families couldn't sleep through the night without someone constantly feeding the fire. The lumberjacks took in 2 families whose cabins had failed. 8 people now shared the 18 by 24-foot space. It was crowded but livable. Most importantly, it was warm. The larger floor plan that had seemed wasteful now proved essential. In a tiny cabin, 8 people would have been impossible. The lumberjacks' cabin accommodated them reasonably. The shelter seekers were amazed by conditions inside. "There's no wind," one woman said with wonder her first night there. "I can't remember the last time I didn't feel wind inside a cabin." She was right. The dovetail corners and hewn logs created an essentially windproof structure. Outside, wind howled at 60 miles per hour with gusts higher. Inside, the air was still. That made every difference in the world for comfort and survival. Throughout February, the cabin proved its worth repeatedly. When the 9-day blizzard hit, whiteout conditions meant no one could go outside safely, even to the woodpile. The Lumberjacks had built their woodshed attached to the main cabin with an interior door. They could access fuel without exposure to the storm. This planning detail, another aspect that had seemed like overcomplicated construction, turned out to be critically important. Several settler families ran desperately low on fuel during that February storm because they couldn't safely reach their wood piles. The Lumberjacks couldn't explain the physics of why their cabin performed so well. They only knew from experience that certain construction methods worked better in extreme cold. But the principles they applied intuitively were real and measurable. A log cabin wall isn't just a structural barrier. It's a thermal system with multiple properties that affect heat retention. The wood itself has natural insulating value. Every inch of thickness provides resistance to heat flow. But the overall performance depends heavily on how logs are joined and sealed. Air infiltration represents the single largest source of heat loss in any structure. Wind passing through cracks and gaps carries away far more heat than mere conduction through solid materials. A cabin with excellent log thickness but poor joints will always lose heat faster than a cabin with thinner logs but perfect sealing. The dovetail corners eliminated infiltration at the structure's most vulnerable points. Standard notched corners, by their geometry, created pathways for air movement. Even when packed with chinking material, thermal expansion and contraction opened these pathways repeatedly through temperature cycles. The dovetail's self-tightening design prevented this problem entirely. The hewn flat surfaces between logs created what modern engineers would call a continuous thermal envelope. Round logs touching along a single line created thousands of tiny gaps across their length. These gaps added up to significant total air exchange. Flat surfaces touching across their full width eliminated those thousands of individual breach points. The pine bark gaskets between courses added another layer of performance. Bark compresses under load but maintains some spring. As logs settled and dried, the bark maintained pressure in the joints. This prevented the gaps that formed in cabins using no gasket material or using materials that dried and crumbled. The larger floor plan's advantages went beyond comfort. Thermal modeling shows that smaller spaces with high heat sources create extreme temperature gradients. Wood near the stove can reach temperatures that cause rapid drying and splitting. Wood far from the stove drops below the dew point, causing condensation and potential rot. Larger spaces with better air circulation maintain more uniform temperatures throughout, reducing thermal stress on all structural elements. The attached woodshed design solved a problem that killed people every winter on the frontier. Disorientation in blizzard whiteout conditions happened quickly. People stepped outside, became confused about direction within seconds, and froze to death within sight of their door. Having critical resources accessible without exterior exposure eliminated this risk entirely. By March 1881, when the brutal winter finally began releasing its grip, the contrast between construction methods was impossible to ignore. The Lumberjacks' cabin emerged from the winter season essentially unchanged. The logs remained tight. The corners showed no separation. The structure needed no repairs. Many settler cabins told different stories. Some had partially collapsed under snow loads. Others had sustained damage from ice accumulation and thermal stress. Nearly all showed widened gaps that would require extensive chinking before the next winter. Several families decided their cabins were beyond reasonable repair and began planning to rebuild entirely. The financial implications were significant. Families who'd built quickly and cheaply in autumn now faced major expenses to repair or replace failed structures. The Lumberjacks, who'd invested extra time in careful construction, had a cabin that would last decades without major maintenance. But the deeper lesson went beyond economics. The difference between adequate and excellent construction had literally meant the difference between life and death that winter. Several families survived only because the Lumberjacks' cabin could accommodate additional occupants. Without that refuge, some almost certainly would have perished. The techniques the lumberjacks used weren't secret knowledge. Dovetail joinery had existed for centuries. Hewn logs and careful sealing were standard practice in Scandinavian countries. The knowledge was available to anyone willing to learn. What separated outcomes wasn't access to information, but willingness to invest effort when payoff seemed distant. In September, spending weeks on perfect corners looked like wasted time. In February, those perfect corners were the reason families stayed alive. This pattern repeated across frontier history. The difference between success and failure often came down to preparation quality. Families who took time to build properly, store adequate provisions, and plan for worst-case scenarios survived hardships that destroyed those who assumed good enough would suffice. The winter of 1880-1881 became known across the Dakota Territory as the Hard Winter or the Snow Winter. Historical records confirm it as one of the most severe weather events the region ever experienced. Temperatures repeatedly dropped below -30 degrees. Blizzards occurred with unprecedented frequency. Snow accumulation broke all previous records. Laura Ingalls Wilder lived through that winter as a teenager in De Smet. Her book, The Long Winter, documented the experience from a settler family's perspective. Modern meteorological analysis of historical records confirms her descriptions were accurate. The winter was as brutal as survivors remembered. The railroad isolation lasted from November 1880 through late April 1881. During those months, communities were entirely cut off from external supplies. Families survived on whatever provisions they'd stored, plus whatever local merchants had in inventory when trains stopped running. Fuel shortages became desperate. Settlers burned twisted hay when wood ran out. They burned furniture, books, anything combustible. Some families sat in near darkness to conserve lamp oil. Children's education stopped because schools couldn't maintain adequate heat. Food rationing grew increasingly strict through the winter. By March, some families were down to a handful of grain per day. Merchants in De Smet distributed remaining supplies under committee supervision to ensure fairness. The alternative was starvation for some, while others had excess. Through all this, certain families fared notably better than others. Those who'd prepared thoroughly before winter had adequate supplies. Those who'd built solid structures stayed warm efficiently. Those who'd planned for contingencies survived challenges that overwhelmed the unprepared. The lumberjacks' cabin became something of a legend in the area. Years later, settlers still told stories about the Finnish fortress that stayed warm while other cabins froze. The cabin itself stood for over 70 years before finally being dismantled in the 1950s. By then, it had outlasted most other structures built in that era by decades. The survival lessons from that winter extended far beyond cabin construction. Preparation mattered. Quality mattered. Knowledge mattered. Taking time to do things right, even when others criticized the effort as excessive, often proved to be the difference between success and catastrophic failure. In modern terms, the story illustrates principles that apply across many fields. Systems under extreme stress reveal their true quality. Shortcuts that work in normal conditions fail when conditions worsen. Expertise and experience provide advantages that seem invisible until crisis arrives. The lumberjacks didn't build their cabin differently to prove a point. They built it that way because they knew what worked. They'd seen enough winters in enough places to understand what separated structures that lasted from structures that failed. They'd internalized lessons that couldn't be learned from books or quick explanations. That accumulated knowledge showed in dozens of details. The tree selection, the bark removal, the hewn surfaces, the dovetail angles, the gasket placement, the floor plan size, the roof pitch, the attached woodshed. Every decision reflected understanding gained through years of experience. When settlers criticized these choices as unnecessary complexity, they did so from limited perspective. They'd never experienced conditions severe enough to test construction to its limits. They'd never seen what happened to cabins built with shortcuts when winter turned truly dangerous. Their criticism came from ignorance, not insight. The hard winter of 1880-1881 changed attitudes across the Dakota Territory. After that experience, settlers paid more attention to construction quality. They asked experienced builders for advice rather than assuming they knew better. They invested more time and effort in doing things properly. The rush to build cheaply and quickly decreased. The understanding that preparation quality determined survival outcomes increased. Communities developed higher standards for acceptable construction. The wisdom gained through suffering that winter influenced building practices for generations. Matti Järvinen, Antti Koskinen, and Eero Virtanen didn't set out to teach lessons or prove points. They simply built a cabin the way they knew how to build one. They used techniques learned from their fathers and grandfathers. They applied knowledge accumulated over generations in climates where poor construction meant death. That their cabin performed so much better than surrounding structures during an extraordinary winter demonstrated something important. Traditional knowledge exists for reasons. Methods that seem overly complicated often embody understanding developed through long experience. Techniques that look unnecessary frequently prove essential when conditions become difficult. The story of their cabin during the winter of 1880-1881 illustrates this principle clearly. What looked like foolish perfectionism in September became life-saving preparation by February. What seemed like wasted effort on trivial details became the reason families survived. What appeared to be unnecessary complexity turned out to be accumulated wisdom about building structures that could withstand extremes. In the end, the difference between the Lumberjacks cabin and typical settler cabins came down to one fundamental principle. The Lumberjacks built for the worst case, not the average case. They prepared for the winter that might come, not the winter that probably would come. They invested effort in details that wouldn't matter most years, but would matter desperately in the rare year when everything went wrong. That year came in 1880-1881, and when it did, the difference between adequate and excellent construction became the difference between families who barely survived and families who lived in relative comfort, between structures that failed and structures that endured, between shortcuts that proved deadly and craftsmanship that saved lives. The cabin built by 3 Finnish lumberjacks stood as proof that preparation quality matters, that expertise matters, that taking time to do things right matters, that accumulated knowledge passed down through generations matters. Those lessons remain relevant far beyond 19th century cabin construction. In any field, the difference between adequate and excellent often seems trivial until conditions become difficult. What looks like unnecessary effort in good times becomes essential investment when circumstances turn challenging. What appears to be perfectionism proves to be proper preparation when the worst case actually arrives. The settlers who laughed at the lumberjacks in September weren't laughing by February. They were grateful the lumberjacks had built the way they knew how to build. Grateful that accumulated knowledge had been applied even when neighbors criticized it as excessive. Grateful that someone had prepared for the winter that actually came rather than the winter everyone expected. That gratitude came too late to change how they'd built their own cabins, but it came in time to influence how they'd build in the future. The hard winter taught lessons that an entire region took to heart. Lessons about preparation, quality, and the value of knowledge that seems excessive until it saves your life. The 3 Finnish lumberjacks never sought recognition for their cabin or their methods. They simply built the way they'd been taught to build, applied knowledge they'd accumulated through years in northern climates, used techniques their families had developed over generations. That their cabin became legendary in the area was almost incidental. The real story wasn't about them. It was about what their methods represented, about the value of expertise and experience, about the importance of preparation quality, about the difference between building something quick and building something right. In September 1880, settlers laughed at three lumberjacks spending weeks on details that seemed unnecessary. By February 1881, those same settlers understood that every detail mattered, that the foolish design was actually accumulated wisdom, that what looked like wasted effort was actually life-saving preparation. The cabin, built with dovetail corners and hewn logs and careful sealing, stood as proof of a simple truth. Quality preparation looks like overkill until you need it. And when you need it, nothing else matters.